All right, well, it's 11 o'clock. Thank you everybody for joining us for this second session of ICAR's annual meetings opening day. We are going to be discussing SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. This is, in ICAR's view and in the view of many organizations that are members and our partners, this is a critical tactic and strategy that's employed by a number of very problematic companies and powerful actors that is designed to silence and restrict the freedom of expression and freedom of association and freedom of assembly of those of us who are working to combat corporate power, to fight against racism and systemic injustice in this country, and is one of the many ways that those with power and those with resources have identified as a way to silence and limit dissent. And if we don't get this right, has the potential to radically limit the way that nonprofits and organizations and community-led groups and individual protesters and people who are speaking out in their communities and in front of their local governing bodies has an ability to really restrict the way that they're able to do that and to prevent us from using our collective power and our individual power and our individual voices to speak up for what we want to see in the world and the ways we want to see change, and only serves to reinforce and entrench the status quo, both in this country and around the world. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today kind of talking through what SLAPs are, how they're used to silence that dissent and that expression, and focus primarily, hopefully, on strategies for combating them. We've at ICAR, in partnership with many other organizations in the Protect the Protest Task Force and through work with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and others, have been thinking a lot about ways to combat SLAPs, stigmatize those who file SLAPs, and make it a safe space for those of us who want to take on powerful interests and create a different world, can do so without fear of being on the wrong side of pernicious and a lawsuit intended to intimidate and drive resources away from a fight. So with that, I'll just quickly give a brief overview of a quick couple of definitions, and then turn it over. We have wonderful panelists who have been working on these issues for a long time, and so I'd like to turn it over to them as quickly as possible. But just for people's frame of reference, SLAP lawsuits, strategic lawsuits against public participation, are lawsuits that are filed, as I said, mostly by people in power, either corporate actors or sometimes government actors, sometimes private individuals, that are meritless at their heart. They do not state a cause of action that can find redress through the courts. They are targeting people who have engaged in protected speech or association or assembly, and they have every right to do that without fear of reprisal or fear of lawsuit. But the SLAP filer seeks to weaponize the things about a court system and a civil code of civil procedure that all of us want to have there and have available for legitimate causes of action, and it seeks to weaponize those elements of a court system to silence people who speak out against them. And so the aims are not to win a lawsuit. The aims are not to ultimately have their grievances redressed through courts. Their aims are to tie up resources, to intimidate, to drive activists away from a space because they fear that they'll be targeted by a lawsuit. Their aims are to, muddy the waters as to who's right and who's wrong in a fight, and to make it look like people who are engaging in protected activity have maybe done something wrong, because we have in this, there's a preconceived notion that if you're a defendant in a lawsuit, maybe there's something there. And so there's a number of ways that SLAP lawsuits, and we'll hear about some more throughout the panel, really have successfully, in some cases, limited work, diverted resources, and made it more difficult for us to exercise our voices. That being said, through the work of many of the people attending this meeting and on this panel and elsewhere, there are strategies and there are approaches and there are ways that the civil society community and the corporate accountability movement in particular can combat slaps, both through defending them in court and making sure that there's victories in court, which we've done successfully in many cases, to providing the kind of stigmatization and communications and campaigning around making sure that slap filers know that the choice to file a slap lawsuit come at a real cost, and then some policy things that we can also get into in the ways that we can try to legislate some protections for this. But the point is that this is a tactic that all civil society has an interest in getting right, and that corporations who file these slaps are also deeply invested in getting wrong. And so we see this as a place to spend some time, because the ability of us to do all of the kind of good work that we're engaged in is potentially affected by the ability to file these suits. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and introduce briefly our panelists here. These are people who've been working on slaps for many, many years in some cases. Our first panelist is Lady Nancy Zuluaga. She's the legal researcher with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. She leads the Resource Center's research on slaps and supports the civic freedoms and human rights defenders and corporate legal accountability programs. We also have with us Leanne Govindsamy, who's the head of the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights in Johannesburg. The program has an anti-slap campaign, Asina, which translated means "we do not fear," and we're going to hear some of the really exciting work that they're taking on in their anti-slap campaigns. And then finally, we have Valentina Stackl, who many of you, if not all of you, know at Greenpeace. She's a multilingual and multicultural storyteller and communications and narrative specialist. She's interested in shifting the imbalance of the global economy and challenging human rights and environmental justice violations with frontline communities. And she's been at Greenpeace USA in the communications shop there, and is the communications and campaigns co-chair of the Protect the Protest Task Force. Before I quickly kick it off with Lady Nancy, I'm going to put up just a very quick, we're going to have a couple of quick poll questions throughout this panel. And the first one, which is going up now, is, we wanted to get a sense of, there's a lot of people on this call who've worked in various parts of civil society, and we wanted to get a sense of, in the regions where you're working, have you seen slap lawsuits brought against civil society members, and have you environmental defenders? We want to kind of get a sense of how, for the people on this call, how and where this tactic is being used. So I'll leave that up for just about 20 seconds and people can start to fill it out. But in the meantime, Lady Nancy is, as I mentioned, the slap researcher at the Resource Center, and I'm going to kick it over to her to give us a little bit of a background about the kind of global landscape of this tactic throughout the world. So thank you, Lady.
Thank you so much, David, for your great introduction and for the invitation to be here today. It is a pleasure to be part of this important panel. In my presentation, I will focus on our current global Slugs project at the Resource Center. Within this project, we are building a database with cases from all of the regions of the world. And we are highlighting this growing phenomenon of slaps, and we also have been supporting human rights defenders and civil society organizations in fighting against slaps. I think the first comment to make is that we are seeing this type of attack in different regions, and some regions are more fertile for slaps. And each context is different in terms of legal terms, but also regarding judicial harassment. For instance, in the Global South, we see the active involvement of governments in criminalizing defenders and supporting companies when they bring lawsuits against defenders. But in countries such as United States, there is an increase of criminalization against demonstrators because of some of the ongoing campaigns such as Black Lives Matter. But of course, in other regions, we are also seeing this kind of attack. So at the Resource Center, we recognize the importance of all of these forms of judicial harassment. But for this particular project, we focus on lawsuits initiated by private parties, by company. They are usually company, but within some of our project, the Resource Center, we also have been working on other forms of judicial harassment. So now regarding our initial findings, if maybe you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So in terms of our initial findings, we have been compiling cases from 2015 onwards. And so far, we have identified 263 cases. And as you can see from the first table, the region most affected by Slavs is the Americas with 119 cases, followed by Asia and Pacific with 75 cases, and Europe and Africa are quite similar in terms of numbers. And in the chart, you see that, as I mentioned before, there are some countries more fertile for Slavs. So we have identified that Thailand, Peru, Honduras, United States, Armenia, and Guatemala are the country with high numbers of Slavs, but of course, this is an ongoing research, so probably the numbers might change a little bit in the following months, but this is what we have identified. So I know that my colleagues are going to share other cases, but I just want to draw the attention about an ongoing case in Honduras, the case of the community of Wapinol. This community between 2018 and 2019 had been targeted by a company there, and they have, like, several members of the community have been charged with criminal complaints, and they have been working on environmental issues regarding the pollution of the Wapinol River and the San Pedro River in that region. So after all the campaign and after they established camp close to the rivers, the company initiated a couple of complaints against the defenders. Some of them have been detained since 2018. Some are waiting for the decision, but this is a very emblematic case in Honduras. As this one, there are other cases in Latin America, in Peru, there are similar cases, but of course, in other regions, we can find similar situations. With all of this amount of cases, I mentioned the 262 cases, we already identify some trends. So if we can go to the next slide. And these trends are in terms of the type of lawsuit, in terms of the legal arguments used by plaintiff, but also about the defenders being targeted and sectors using Slavs. So on the first table, you see that around 63% of the total number of cases are related to criminal complaints, and this is very common in the global south. So in the global north, we see more civil cases. As you can see, 28% of the cases are civil, and we have other remained 9% that are a mix between civil and criminal complaints. And something very important to mention about the legal arguments is that in many cases, the plaintiff use multiple charges. And this is quite common in Latin America and in Asia. So plaintiffs use usually 2, 3, or even 4 legal arguments against the defender. And when we talk about criminal procedures, it's quite scary because usually they include high prison sentence. So, but at least in all of the cases, we identify that the most common legal arguments are defamation, damages, illicit association. This is quite scary when we talk about freedom of association and freedom of assembly. And also in Latin America, we see a lot of cases related to usurpation of land, threats, and instigation, instigating a strike. So I think this is very important when we think about future strategies or legal strategies, because depending on the jurisdiction, the cases are related with criminal complaints. So now to the next slide. We see also, as I mentioned before, we see some trends regarding sectors, and you can see on the first chart that the most common sectors using slabs are mining and agriculture and livestock. But of course, there are other sectors involved in these kind of attacks, such as logging and lumber, hydroelectric power, and we also see a couple of cases related to tourism, waste disposal, and technology. And finally, in terms of the defenders affected, it's very important to mention that the community's leader have been targeted a lot, and this is like the majority of the cases are related to community leaders. So we have around 111 cases, but also environmental activists, workers, journalists, indigenous peoples, unions have been targeted by this kind of attack. But apart from that, I think it's so important to highlight that usually those people have been working on environmental and labor rights concerns. So there is a very important to recognize this, because at the end, the total number of cases include mainly environmental and labor rights concerns. So now to the next slide, there are other things that we are looking at, but I think I don't have much time left, and I just want to give a couple of conclusions, but we can discuss a little bit more in our discussion. So first, we see that this is a powerful attack. Slabs are powerful attack in different regions. As David mentioned, the idea of this kind of attacks is to silence the defenders, and it's a clear violation of the human rights, particularly the rights of freedom of expression, association, and personal integrity. And also, slabs have a lot of consequences on defenders, but I think the most important one are regarding the financial loss and the psychological impacts on the defenders. And also something very important to mention is, at least in Latin America and in Asia and Africa, this kind of lawsuit usually take years. So 2, 3, 10 years, even in some cases in Latin America. So of course, this has an important impact on the defender's work. So finally, I think it's so important to mention that for all of these consequences on the social movement, is very important to involve responsible business, investors, and governments to protect defenders and to take measures to prevent people from being targeted. So just to finalize my presentation, I just want to mention that we have some resources about the slabs on our website. So you can just check our website on the bottom of the slide, and we have 3 important resources, and in those resources we provide a couple of our initial findings, but also recommendations to different stakeholders. So I think my time is just over. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I will be open to answer any question.
Thank you so much, Lady. We'll be sure to post those resources in the chat so that people can actually click on the links, because I know that those are phenomenal documents for people who are looking for more information. Some of those numbers to me just really stick out. The breadth of the types of activists and civil society spaces that are affected by SLAPs, I think, is particularly critical to note. Before I turn it over to Leanne to talk specifically about their kind of anti-SLAP campaign and their work, we're just going to put up a second poll very quickly here, and we'll leave it up for for just a moment, but you know, what we're looking for is to, of the slaps that you know about, you know, which of these two categories do they likely fall into? Because these are places where we've, at ICAR and amongst our members, we've seen the most, but we want to get a sense of whether this captures the space, and or if there are others that you can post into the chat. Because there's, as we mentioned, this is affecting a broad swath of civil society that we want to be able to see that space. So with that, I think I'll kick it over to Leanne and to hear more about your campaign.
Thanks, David. Good day, panelists, and thank you to the colleagues at ICAR for organizing this discussion. Yeah, and thank you to Lady for that really excellent presentation. I think that's such important work in terms of being able to put together the data on slaps, which is really missing in terms of understanding how prevalent it is across the world. So thank you for that, Lady. Corporate intimidation and bullying in South Africa and the kind of experience that we've had has arisen in the environmental sector. As David mentioned, I'm from the Center for Environmental Rights. I think there are numerous reports which speak to the fact that slaps arise particularly or are quite difficult for environmental defenders just because of the nature of the work that they do. So today I'm basically just going to speak about the example of the slap suit that we are facing, or defending and assisting the defendants in terms of their legal defense, and provide some strategies in terms of how we've been able to deal with it. So lawyers, former lawyers at the CER, other lawyers, journalists and activists have been sued by an Australian mining company that is mining on the west coast of South Africa. Currently has authorization to mine in about 42 kilometers of really pristine coastline in the west coast. And it seeks to mine in an area called Kolobeni on the east coast of South Africa, where communities there have really come together to say no to mining. And where there have been just a host of issues that have arisen, where a community activist was killed. It's been linked to the company. There have been a lot of allegations in respect to what happened to this particular individual. However, the murder of the activist hasn't been resolved. So maybe back to this particular company, as I've said, it's an Australian mining company. It mines sand, so literally mines on the beaches in South Africa. And the reason it has sued environmental activists, lawyers, journalists is because of comments made by them, particularly relating to a cliff collapse in the area, which they deny having been responsible for. And so, if I give you a bit of context, two of my former colleagues were giving a lecture at a university, at a summer school, and the company basically arranged for a candidate attorney or a trainee lawyer to video this particular lecture, and on the basis of that video, proceeded to sue the lawyers that, the former lawyers at CER. And that was in 2017. And we still now in 2020 haven't really made much progress in terms of finalizing this matter, which is, as I think most of you know, the objective of a slap suit, to drag civil society, community activists through extensive litigation, expensive litigation, as Lady already mentioned, causing a lot of psychological and emotional harm over and above the financial kind of implications. So what are we doing about this corporate bullying in South Africa? Well, the first thing is that the CER is assisting in the legal defense of this matter. And that involves putting together resources, putting together the best lawyers and the best team that we can in order to defend this slap suit. And the second is to really build solidarity here in South Africa and around the world in relation to defending the slap suit. And that's where the campaign has really been quite important. It's called Asina Loyiko. As David's mentioned, it means we do not fear. And it's really standing up together against corporate bullying. And we try to coordinate environmental defenders, those who have been intimidated, here and across the world. We try to share their stories, share their experiences, share resources. I think the resources here are quite important. Being able to have a resource hub that is not just what is SLAP, what is it about, but being able to say to people, look, you can be able to access strategies on SLAP suits here. You were able to obtain legal assistance at these links or through these organizations, psychological assistance through these organizations, but very importantly, because of the physical harm that has come to so many defenders, being able to connect them with organizations that can move them to a safe place or provide them with some sort of better security. And so our website, which is going live on the 13th of October, aims to be able to pull those resources together. But quite importantly, have people share their stories. It's quite a balance of being able to ensure the safety of people whilst also having their stories told and told by them, and building some sort of media protection, if you may, in respect of them, so that they become less threatened through the exposure that they get in the media. I think one of the really important things to highlight in respect of what we've been able to do, and we've been able to do this because we're a civil society organization, but also a group of lawyers and a law clinic, is we have actively resisted this particular mining operation on the West Coast. This has involved appeals against environmental authorizations, against prospecting applications, getting experts to tell us about heritage impacts and biodiversity impacts, because this mine is located in a critical biodiversity area. Just today, we have filed a judicial review in the High Court to review a decision of our environmental minister to grant environmental authorization for the extension of this mine. So you can see that there's a lot of resources, both financial and in terms of expertise, that's required to really resist a particular operation. Some of the other strategies that we've looked at is where a corporation is not necessarily based in the country that you're operating in, participating in the AGMs of that particular corporation listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. We've tried to do that by being able to engage with CSOs there that ask questions at the AGM. And also just really having a good sense of the company's operations across the world. Is this being experienced in other areas and that kind of thing? So I think, I've very briefly gone through what is a massive campaign for the CER in terms of the resources that we have to put into it, the time that we have to put into it. And I guess really here, if there are any key takeaways from my presentation today, it's, you have to have strategies in place for funding, for insurance, for risk mitigation on all fronts, building solidarity locally and internationally, and really just being able to understand what people are doing around the world. And I think these kinds of discussions and the discussion hosted by ICAR enables us to do that today, right? And be able to connect into each other's stories and experiences. So I will end my presentation there and say that, SLAP suits can be very difficult. It can be very difficult both on those who are the defendants in SLAP suits, but also on the civil society activists that are working to support them. It has a host of challenges that I've mentioned, but there's also a lot of power that lies with civil society in terms of coming together, being able to resist a corporation that thinks it's untouchable, being able to have the voices, particularly of Black female women who are at the forefront of these issues, being able to really tell people what their experiences are and being able to stand up against a massive corporation. So I'll end my presentation there, and I really look forward to engaging with you all throughout the rest of the discussion and fielding any questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Yeah, the toll of that this plays on the defendants and the civil society that have been engaged is substantial. And as you state, one thing that can help, build that power and ease that burden is when other civil society that aren't directly involved in SLAPP kind of step in and stand in solidarity with those who've been slapped. And so with that, before I quickly turn it over to Valentina, I'm just going to put up a third poll to quickly ask how many of you through your organizations or in your work have spoken out and spoken with people who have been slapped or otherwise judicially harassed in the regions where you work, because this is, slaps are most successful when the organization who is being targeted or the people who are being targeted are isolated and feel alone and are alone. And it's only through coming together as a civil society that we're going to be able to make this this tactic, not appealing to the people who would otherwise file SLAPP lawsuits. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Valentina to tell us a little bit more about some strategies and some work that PTP is doing.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Leanne and Lady Nancy. Super interesting to hear the global overview of what's happening. And I'm so glad to see so many familiar names and faces on this webinar today. I know a lot of you have worked on fighting SLAPP, sometimes personally as targets of SLAPP suits, so thank you for being here today. I want to talk a little bit about Protect the Protest Task Force. I've spent many, many hours of the last 2 or 3 years on this project, and a lot of you know already about it, but as David explained, and as the other panelists have already explained, that for decades, the powerful have attempted to silence their critics by filing meritless lawsuits intended to intimidate them, intimidate watchdogs and advocacy groups. And these SLAPP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation, are just an abuse of the court system and really a violation of our First Amendment rights to speak truth to power. And so this is why a wide range of organizations across different sectors, including ICAR, and I see some folks from Earth Rights On, and Greenpeace as well, we're at about 25 or 30 right now. We basically all came together in 2018 and we said enough is enough. We need to band together and sort of create a group of ragtag organizations that says if you've come against one, you come against all of us. The Protect the Protest Task Force is really committed to ending the threat of SLAPPs in civil society and to protect free speech and democracy more broadly. If SLAPP bullies had their way, there would be no people speaking out against, harmful environmental issues with extractive projects or even critical comments left on a Yelp review for a restaurant, but that's for a different matter. If you go to the next slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about how we started. So in 2018, well, the sort of conversations were happening earlier, but it really came from a need of, there was organizations and individuals like Greenpeace that were getting slapped by different companies. At the time, it was 2 major lawsuits. One was Resolute Forest and one was Energy Transfer, which is the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is a picture of our launch day. We had a simultaneous launch day in the East Coast and West Coast in September of 2018. And the one in New York City was in front of the Kasowitz Benson Torres law firm. This New York City law firm was hired by Resolute and various other companies to represent them in these lawsuits. So they're really known to be like one of the worst ones doing this kind of stuff and supporting these kinds of lawsuits. If you go to the next slide, we also had a little event on the same day at the same time on the Arctic Sunrise, which is one of the Greenpeace ships on the West Coast. And just a couple of pictures here. If you go to the next slide, this is who we are today. As you can see, there's a variety of different organizations who do a lot of different things, a lot of them environmentally focused. And and I want to tell you a little bit about our approach and how we do things. So if you go to the next slide, please. Our approach, we do a lot of different things, but we kind of separate it out into sort of three main approaches. If you go to the next slide. The first one is building resilience to SLAPs. And what does this mean? Basically, it means that we provide resources and training for civil society organizations and community leaders, journalists, and the broader public of how to protect themselves from SLAPs and what to do if they're targeted. This includes a network of attorneys to defend those facing SLAPs, especially individuals and smaller organizations that have much more limited resources. But what we also do is webinars. We have a really informative website. We have brochures that we created that really share information about how you can protect yourself from these SLAP suits. Next slide, please. Our second approach is exposing SLAPs and those who file them. So we draw on our organization's campaigns and communications and legal expertise to support public interest advocates and watchdogs targeted by SLAPs. We campaign against the biggest SLAP offenders, and we provide legal defense to those who need it. And in practice, really what this means is we kind of take them to the court of public opinion. We do media activities and projects, storytelling, and social media. And because there are so many of us, you know, when we have one sort of like unified voice, it can be very powerful. Our third approach is campaigning on strategic issues. So we mobilize our collective resources to protect the right for free speech and for peaceful protest. And we do this very strategically. And I think we've done a good job responding to the moment. You know, when we first started, it was these big environmental lawsuits that we were facing. But as we are sort of finding our way in this big space of SLAP litigators and campaigners, I think we are responding to the moment, and we're sort of reevaluating what our role can be. And some of our most, you know, we target specific, we can target specific companies, but also sort of issue areas. Some examples of some things we've done is we've supported on Anti-Chevron Day, for example, all of our favorite bad guy, as well as we've done Slappy Awards each year, where we give a sort of satirical award to the worst slappers of that year. You can check all those things out on our website. A couple of other campaign examples that I want to give you because I'm big on storytelling. If you go to the next slide, please. Over here, we have a group of folks that are called the Weed Nine. That has nothing to do with marijuana, but it's a town called Weed. And so it's a group of 9 folks and their entire town actually that was fighting for water, for their water in their community. So in the middle there, you can see Jim Taylor. He's the president of the Water for Citizens of Weed. For over 100 years, Weed citizens have relied on the nearby Shasta Mountain Spring as their main source of drinking water until Roseburg Forest Products came in and wanted to sell it to some international bottling industry. To add insult to injury, the company then slapped a number of residents fighting for their water rights to silence them. In the end, after a lot of legal battle, the judge found the citizens of Weed not responsible and dismissed the case. And this is, for example, one of the groups of people that we helped as a task force. We helped them with their media, we helped them with legal support, and we also helped them organize when they had a little activity, a little protest activity in front of Roseburg's offices. Next slide, please. And then this one, so part of like a big barrage of ongoing lawsuits that were filed by Energy Transfer, the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, against Greenpeace and others, also included a lawsuit against Crystal Tubles, who is an Oglala, Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne woman from Montana. She's a U.S. Army veteran and an organizer from Standing Rock. Basically, what happened there is that Crystal, along with many others, came to Standing Rock to defend their land. And tons and tons and tons of people were sued, and this lawsuit is still ongoing. It was thrown out on the federal level. It's now in North Dakota courts, and we are continuing supporting Crystal as well as the other defendants in this case. And we do this, obviously through legal support, but we also are helping with communications and storytelling as well. I will wrap it up just with a few resources. If you go to the next slide, please. If you are being slapped, or if someone you know is being slapped, we have a Get Help section on our website, protecttheprotest.org. There you can fill out a form and say like, help, I'm getting slapped. We don't know what to do. And that's really the first step for us to spring into action and see what we can do to help you. Next slide, please. So find us on Twitter at Slap Task Force, or online on our website, protecttheprotest.org. Or if you want to contact me, my Twitter handle is Valentina Stackl, or vstackl at greenpeace.org. You can send me an email. And then I just leave you with the next slide. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. Frederick Douglass. If you have any questions, please let me know. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Val. We're going to open it up to Q&A in just a second. So if people have questions, I know many of you I'm sure do, and I know just put them in the Q&A part of the chat below. And I mean, there are many people in this meeting who have both spoken out against slaps for issues that they're concerned about, as well as several who've been slapped, including at the organizational level and at the personal level. I think this is one of the tagline of Protect the Protests, and is intrinsic in the work that Leanne was describing, as well as, if you need to build solidarity, and you need to set up a mindset where if you come for one of us, you've come for all of us. In the previous presentation, there was a lot of talk, needed discussion about the move from becoming being an ally to being an accomplice, and being somebody who will stand and take risk alongside the people who are most affected. That we shouldn't, use our whatever privilege we have to stand protected while other people are relied on to put themselves in harm's way, both and including with judicial harassment and facing slap lawsuits. So I think that kind of mindset of civil society needs to be strengthened, and there need to be clear on-ramps so that when these cases come forward, it's clear how civil society can stand stand together and fight these things. Because as Leanne was saying, they take a lot of time and resources and have an enormous toll. With that, I think as people are putting their questions in, I'll just kick it off. I just wanted to turn back to Lady and quickly ask, you laid out a lot of really incredible research, and I know that research is still ongoing. And you had laid out some kind of initial conclusions in your summary, but I just wanted to give you a chance to circle back to that. And, there's things that we can be doing as civil society, but I also wanted to, and this, the other panelists can jump in as well, but government has a clear role to play in this. Outside of, as you mentioned, Lady, outside of North America, governments are often complicit, or they're the ones who are working hand in glove with corporations to file some of these suits. What roles can governments be playing, and how can we as civil society be working with governments, to either strengthen their anti-slap laws if they have them? A number of states in the United States have anti-slap laws, and at PTP we're working to increase that number, as well as push for federal protection. And also, how can we call out governments who work in collaboration with corporations who are seeking to silence dissent? I think we need to be thinking about how to incorporate governments into our advocacy, because they play a critical role in both solution and is a problematic actor.
Thank you, David, for that great question. And I think there are a couple of things that government could do in order to protect offenders. And I think the first point is to implement a strong and good legal frameworks in protecting human rights offenders. This is so important because we see that in so many regions, there are not good legal frameworks in that matter. The second point, and is related to that, is have a strong legal frameworks about SLAPs. As you mentioned, in US and in other countries in Asia, for example, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, there's some anti-SLAPs legislation. And in Europe, for example, there's also an ongoing campaign about pushing for these kind of legal frameworks. But we see that other regions such as Africa and Latin America, we don't have this kind of legal framework. So I think it's so important to promote by civil society, but also government should implement a strong legal frameworks in order to prevent SLAPs. And the other important point to mention is that judges and prosecutors have an important role to play. So this is why governments should also implement trainings or should implement the implementation of human rights standards internally. And related to that, it's also so important to increase awareness about SLAPs. As we already mentioned, in some regions, there are not that much awareness about this trend. So I think it's so important to work with civil society organizations through campaigns or coalitions to promote awareness about this issue and trying to implement other strategies. At least in Latin America, we are not seeing this kind of strategies, and everything is just go through criminalizations done by the state, and it's also very important. But we need also people speaking about this private censorship, this side of the private censorship that is very frequently in Latin America.
Val, I was wondering if you could, I mean, the statistics that Lady has put together and is putting together through the Resource Center's research are compelling and incredible and shocking in some ways. I mean, you also touched on this, Val, the power of the stories behind each of those numbers is an individual or an organization or a community group that is facing a lawsuit purely based on their activism. You know, how can we as a community do a better job of telling those stories and demonstrating the, you know, the real pain that comes from, you know, from being targeted for standing up for what is right and what you think is right and what is your right to stand up for. That I think is something that you mentioned. I want to give you a chance to speak a little bit more about that because it can be incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think something interesting about slap suits is that nobody actually calls them a slap suit when they're suing you, right? And so it's a little bit tricky to realize what is happening to you, especially if you don't have a network that is supporting you. And so I think telling these stories and hearing kind of like the kinds of thing, like what does a slap suit look like, right? Slap suits are not called slap suits, right? But what are they doing? They're isolating activists from each other. They're intimidating and silencing activists. They're diverting resources. They're scaring off supporters. And so if we talk about what the effect is and like what that looks like, then more and more people can say, oh, actually, this is also happening to me. And we can grow a bigger network of people that can support each other. I also think that it's important to look at the variety of stories that are out there. If you look on our website, we have environmentalists of all ages, of all like sizes of their organizations or individuals who are being targeted. But there's also really sinister slap suits against survivors of abuse, against protesters, etc. So I think, you know, for me, I always say the story is what connects people. It's the shortest distance between two people is a story. And so I think as long as we keep telling these stories and find ways to amplify them, then we will be able to grow our network and grow our numbers and support each other more.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical point. Nobody receives a summons or a subpoena or anything that says, you know, this is a slap suit, and so that the person, especially if they're not part of the civil society community, knows the, you know, what Google search term to enter and find resources. It's going to require us to popularize this idea, and so that when people do face lawsuits, they, either through that episode of the, Colbert Report or John Oliver, whatever they saw, that will, trigger in their mind that there are resources or might be resources out there for them to connect with and to receive help. Leanne, I just wanted to get a sense from you. Somebody asked, how hard or how easy has it been as the organization facing a SLAPP lawsuit? What's been the reaction of other civil society that you've reached out to? Are people eager to jump in and stand in solidarity with your campaign? Has there been reluctance and fear, or the SLAPP suit having that result? I wanted to give you a chance to speak to what it is like to reach out and seek solidarity when you're facing a threat like this.
Thanks, David. I guess the one thing to note is that the organization itself is not facing the SLAPP suit. It's the former lawyers at the CER, and so it's a very complex situation in terms of having to host the campaign and build solidarity whilst being very respectful of the individual defendants and what they're having to go through in so many different ways. South Africa has such a strong public interest sector, so many organizations that have a history of human rights defense work in the country. And so the response has been really great. You've had public interest law organizations, community-based organizations really come forward and support us and stand in solidarity. During the course of last year, one of the kind of interlocutory applications were heard at the Cape High Court, and we organized a protest, and it was quite incredible. You had, community members that drove in from the West Coast, as well as so many lawyers and so many other activists that came through in support of that protest. And even during a hearing that was held this year, where importantly, we argued that SLAPP is an abusive process. So for the first time, in South Africa, we have made the argument in legal papers saying that SLAPP is an abusive process. The kind of online support in terms of people posting pictures saying, Asina Loyiko standing in solidarity, with environmental defenders was quite incredible. And I think it's really about how are you communicating to everything that those on the panel have said today. How are you making this as easy to understand as possible? Because it can be sometimes a little bit technical, a little bit foreign. And maybe just to touch on very briefly the question around government intervention, David, that you were asking. I think one of the key things is the regulation of corporations. If our environmental departments, for example, are properly regulating these corporations and their impacts on the environment, environmental defenders don't have to go to the lengths that they do to be able to defend their land, water, soil and air. So that I think is really key, and being able to challenge them on that. And also just really good grievance mechanisms for being able to make those challenges instead of forcing community members into legal process to challenge corporations. So I think, I hope that was.
Yeah, I think that's just such an excellent point, that every, behind most SLAPP suit is a breakdown in a more fundamental systemic problem, where if the companies who, are given free rein to, destroy the environment or, or go after protesters in whatever way, those protesters are there because of a breakdown. And those land rights defenders are there because there's, a broader set of failures of governmental regulation to ensure that their rights would be protected without having to, put themselves in harm's way and make themselves subject to a suit like this. So I think that's such an excellent point. We're coming up on the end of both the time for this panel and of today's opening day for ICAR's annual meeting. So I just wanted to quickly, I'll make a couple quick closing remarks, but before I do that, I just wanted to provide our panelists with an opportunity if there's anything else you wanted to add, starting with Valentina around the work of SLAPP suits and how we can best move forward.
Thank you so much for being here today. And I just really want to say that there's something very beautiful about coming together of different organizations, and what we need to do to be successful is really tackle this issue on all fronts, on the policy level, on the legal level, communications and campaigning, because that's the only way we're gonna really win. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if you ever have any questions or thoughts, please shoot us an email or check us out on our website, and share with your friends and colleagues, because yes, again, people don't necessarily know sometimes that they're being slapped, but they're being bullied, legally bullied, and we can help with that. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sal. Lady or Leanne, anything to add?
Thank you, David. Yeah, I just wanted to add something about the differences in terms of the impacts against the defenders being targeted. And this is something that we need to talk and learn more, because depending on the context, the legal context, the jurisdiction, and so on, each defender can have different kind of impact. So we also need to think about this in order to provide a good support to the defenders. It's not the same when we talk about indigenous people being targeted or when we talk about environmental activists. So I think it's so important to think about this, and also to implement a strategy to support financially the defenders, and also to give advice about the risks in terms of defamation, because as Leanne mentioned, there's many companies that have different work in different jurisdictions, and of course, depending on the jurisdiction, a campaign could be defamatory or not. So I think it's also so important to provide legal advice about risks in terms of defamation and so on. So thank you so much, David.
Maybe just as a closing thought, you know, these oftentimes, you know, you're dealing with a company that is a multinational, that is operating in so many different countries, and a platform like this gives us the opportunity to share information on what this company has done, but then also be able to go out there and question this company and challenge this company through social media and through other ways. You know, you being able to use social media to repeat the defamatory allegations, the alleged defamatory allegations, and be able to say activists are being sued, here are the papers, or here are the reasons they are being sued, is such a good way to do exactly what the corporation doesn't want you to do. And you can still say it's alleged. You can, you know, you could repeat exactly what is in the court papers because they have set it out in their own legal process. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the power of just repetition and repetition at scale. So I think that's something that could be really crucial as we kind of connect the dots around the world in terms of the work that we're doing.
Thank you all so much. I think it's so critical. You know, we talked about a number of environmental cases, and I think that part of why those cases are kind of at the leading edge of SLAPPs is that those are the environmental and land rights defenders are at the, you know, at the right nexus or the wrong nexus of, you know, a corporate actor with significant financial, you know, gains at stake, and individual communities that are, you know, kind of there on the ground. And as we see, hopefully more spaces coming into the corporate accountability movement and challenging more ways outside of the environmental space where corporations are, you know, using their power to, you know, to you know, make money at other people's rights. I'm thinking of the private prison industry and others. You know, we're going to those are places where they're going to work hard and deploy any tactic that they can to, you know, to maintain their power and to maintain their financial incentives. And this infrastructure that's being built up is going to be critical to making sure that those SLAPP suits aren't successful. With that, I think I'll close this panel, and then we'll also close this opening day of ICAR's annual meeting. We're gathering again on Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we're going to be beginning with a conversation led by Katie Redford, as many of you know, and Kathy Feingold, who many of you also know, on kind of the intersections and the points of conversation that need to happen between the environmental movement and the labor movement. These are two incredible leaders of those spaces, and so we're really pleased to begin our conversation on Wednesday morning with them, in addition to several other speakers. So I hope that all of you will be able to join us back here on Wednesday for ICAR's second day of its annual meeting. Thank you so much for joining us today.